you to the EGROW Friday webinar series. We have been very fortunate that we have done already more than 310 webinars, and that means we have had an opportunity to listen to about 900 people, and about 450 hours have already been docked in exchange and dissemination of knowledge worldwide, because we have been handling contemporary issues not only within India, but we have been handling global issues also. Under G20, we did series of 11 webinars on new international economic order, on women empowerment 6 extra, and on climate 6 extra. On Trump and tariffs, we have already done 6 webinars, and we have had global experts speak on these issues. We are very fortunate. 5 Nobel laureates and as Nobel laureates have come and spoken at EGROW. But I'm also happy to tell you that Professor Philip Aghion, our speaker, in May 2021, has just received the Nobel Prize. So with that account, 6 Nobel laureates have come and spoken at EGROW. I mention this especially because the prize that Professor Aghion has gotten is on constructive destruction. That's exactly what he came and spoke here in May 2021. Professor Dr. Ashok Vishandas was chairing that session, I think, and Dr. Arvind Virmani was also in that session. And I thought that is such a path-breaking research that Professor Aghion has presented deserves a Nobel Prize. I think I mentioned it also. And now, Professor Aghion took that research beyond Schumpeter. Schumpeter was very pessimist. Where will capitalism end? And there's going to be a crash eventually because constructive destruction takes over. But then Professor Aghion said, no, competition plays a role. And because of competition, innovation plays a role. And through innovation, something new will emerge. So new will take over and old will pass on. Well, there are studies, and yesterday's in the interview at Doordarshan, I and there's another professor from IIT Kanpur made a point that the constructive destruction reminds many of us of the Indian philosophy and reincarnation, and of course, Lord Shiva. And therefore, there was a very interesting discussion yesterday, and it'll be on the EGROW website, that TV interview. The point I am invoking this argument is very, very pertinent for the book which is being discussed today with the lead author, Dr. Srivastava, India's Growth Narrative. Professor Srivastava is also talking about the Hindu growth rate, which we all, when we were young in the college, used to feel very depressed. But the way he has spoken about the book and in his book and the growth rate and the revised and I'm sure he's going to speak at length about it, he speaks about the enhanced growth rate, and that's also the Hindu growth rate, which has evolved over the period and which is now, and I believe it's still less, and if we have 9% plus, we'll be able to score the threshold level of developed world. Today, the threshold level is 14,000 US dollars. By the time 2047, I'm expecting it to be 17,000 US dollars. We are at 2,880 per capita income. To bridge this gap, we'll have to grow really fast. And the skeptics who say we can't, I always tell them, please look at Korea, 1962 to 89, despite the global crisis. And I'm very happy that Professor Mahendra, Professor Srivastava are here, scholars, and the vintage that I am. 1962 to 89, Korea grew at 8% plus. And please remember, the oil price shocks happened during that time. To some extent, the crisis in the Gulf was happening. The dollar decoupled from the gold, and Korea steadfastly did it. Of course, one can say, look at the political system. Fine. China did it 1980 to 2012, 9.9%, again unparalleled. And between 1980 to 2012, you know the type of global challenges that emerged, and China still did it. I think India can also do it. And also, we have to remember, and I love this book because of that reason. Well, we may enter that club. The entry of the club is around 14,000 to 17,000 US dollars. But within that club, there's America, which is not the highest per capita income of 85,000. There are countries scoring more than that. But then we have to gallop. Now, my interest in galloping growth is not just entering the club. The world has reached a stage where stronger economies have a say in political decisions. And that has always been the case. Political economy, politics and economy have always been related. America can get away with whatever they want, global financial crisis, Trump tariffs, just because they are international reserve currency. China can get away with all that it does because its per capita income is around 15,000 US dollars. So I think we need to catch up and we have the will. Luckily, the Prime Minister is of the view and sides we economists. Look at the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council that he has set up. Look at the vision that he has of 2047. I think we are so lucky to have a Prime Minister who is willing to give us a long rope and allows us to grow. So I think we need to encash this. And of course, demographic dividend is something which is available with us. We can't let it go offhand. It's only available for 20 years. This book is so rich. It speaks about the past, speaks about the second 5-year plan, speaks about the Green Revolution, and also speaks about the future. And this sort of a book only comes once in 50 or 100 years. And the author, Dr. Srivastava himself, is so experienced with his age. He has written this book purely out of his experience. So I think it's going to be a treatise for all of us in the next few minutes to listen and watch the journey which has been undertaken and then go ahead in the days ahead. Now, both the speakers for today have been at our forum earlier, so I'm going to be very brief for the introduction. Because of the greatness of this book, the topic that it has picked up, the canvas that it has for itself, 100 years straight away, we invited Professor Mahendra to kindly chair this session for two reasons. Firstly, he himself is a very strong economist, worked at various important places, and right now occupies the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council chair. Who better than him would be able to guide us after listening to all that we are going to talk today? And he kindly conceded to chair the session. I want to thank him. We postponed it. He still agreed to chair it. I really want to thank him for sparing time out of his busy schedule. The author, the first author of this book is Dr. D.K. Srivastava. He is the Chief Policy Advisor at Ernst Young and an honorary professor at Madras School of Economics. Now, I always envy Professor Srivastava because he is in the golden touch of the Chandan tree, which is Dr. C. Rangarajan. Now, somebody who has an opportunity to be in such in close touch with Dr. C. Rangarajan, you can well imagine, while he himself is a good economist, Dr. C. Rangarajan, another great economist, so country is getting the best of both of them together in the writings. Sometimes they do together, and sometimes I see the reflection in Dr. Srivastava's writings, and I can easily see Dr. C. Rangarajan's benefit that he draws upon. With this brief introduction, I'm going to invite my colleague, my founder director of EGROW, Dr. Vishen Das, to share a few thoughts initially, and then we will hand over to Professor Mahendra to chair the session. Dr. Vishen Das?
Yes. Good evening to everyone, the chair, the speaker, and my dear colleague, Professor Charan Singh, and he compressed everything in a few minutes, and he gave a very brief introduction that becomes very interesting. Just two, three things quickly. The India growth narrative that reminds me of the Henry Kissinger. Many years ago, he wrote, "The economic strength is the currency of power." And then these four authors led by D.K. Srivastava, I can see that three authors out of the four are on this website. D.K. Srivastava ji, Tarun Kapoor, and Ragini. I don't find Mr. Bhardwaj is there. But more important is always a joy to listen to Professor Mahendra Dev. He had been my predecessor in CACP. He chaired the CACP much earlier than I joined. And then we had the privilege of, I have a privilege of traveling with him to Milan and then to Venice. We had a wonderful time once. That, of course, is again 10, 11 years old. But it's always a joy to hear to him. So without standing between them and the audience, I say I myself am very excited to listen to India's growth because that's so captivating. I had the glimpse of the book on performance of India's performance for 100 years. That's a marvelous piece, in fact, well analyzed, and it dissects the economy layer by layer and field by field. I'm sure all audience and the chair and the speakers will be very excited to listen to. Over to you, to the chair, our Professor Charan. Thank you very much.
Professor Mahendra Dev, over to you.
Dr. Charan Singh, Professor Vishant Das, Dr. Srivastava, good evening to all of you, and also happy Diwali to all of you.
Thank you very much.
At the outset, I thank the EGROW Foundation for inviting me to this important webinar. First, let me congratulate Dr. D.K. Srivastava and his three colleagues, Murali Krishna Bharadwaj, Tarun Kapoor, and Ragini Trehan, for writing this excellent book. So this book provides, narrative of 100 years of economic growth. I was part of another EGROW webinar on similar topic and released this book. Happy to participate in this webinar, which particularly focuses on this book.
Yes.
So the book is about past, present, and future of India's growth. It's a narrative and performance and potential, 1951-52 to 2050-51. So Dr. Srivastava will give details, but it basically examines growth and policies for 7 phases of growth. First 5 phases are up to 2012. The 6th one is 2012 to 25. And the 7th last one is about the future, which he calls the Hindu growth phase, 2025 to 2051. So I will just say a few words on the strategies since independence and source of growth, future. I think Professor Das, you have to mute. Vishant Das. Yeah. So Dr. Srivastava will speak about the book, but I will just say a few words on the strategies since independence and source of growth for future. So as the book says, if you look at the history till 1700 AD, India's share in world GDP was the highest at 25%, China at 22%, and Japan, Germany, USA, it was 1% or less. But of course, it started declining after the Industrial Revolution in Britain and Europe. It declined further during the British period from 12% in 1870 to 4.2% in 1950. And China's also declined to around 4.6%. But share of USA increased to 25% by 1950. So that was the thing of share of India's share in world GDP. Regarding past, as you know, at the time of independence, even Jawaharlal Nehru and Congress and many others were influenced by the socialistic ideas. So first 3 decades, we had protection policies. more state involvement, public sector dominated. Also, the second 5-year plan, Mahalanobis model, preferred heavy industry focus. And also employment, primary education were neglected at that time. Of course, we had some achievements like big irrigation projects, higher education push, green revolution. But however, growth was low and labor-intensive manufacturing was not undertaken. So in the first 3 decades, it was 3.5% growth rate, although some fluctuations were there. So my Delhi School of Economics teacher, Professor Krishna, called it Hindu rate of growth. But the book by Dr. Srivastava and his colleagues say that Hindu rate of growth is not 3.5%, but as mentioned by Professor Krishna, but Hindu rate growth is 7%. And also they say it is consistent with the saving and investment rates prescribed in India's ancient texts, which showed that high savings and investment rates and growth. So by the end of 1970s, many countries, particularly East and Southeast Asia, including China, introduced economic reforms. Of course, India introduced in 1991. So we are led by 15 years. So we missed the bus 2 times. First, initially in 1950s, where we didn't focus on, manufacturing sector. Can you please move? Mr. Vishal Das. Okay. So we are 2 times we missed. First 1950s, and the second time we missed 15 years late. The 1991 we started, whereas earlier people started late 70s or so, including China. So in the last 3 decades, we had the growth reform period, average growth 6 to 6.5% per annum. Of course, growth rate differs from one decade to another, depending on the shocks. We had financial crisis in 2008, taper tantrum in 2013, NBFC crisis in 2018, COVID in 2020-21. Now, of course, the tariff, shock. But we have overcome all these shocks, and Indian economy is resilient and continues to be the fastest growing country among large economies. The country, it continues to be, becoming the largest and the 3rd largest economy by the end of the decade. Hopefully, we'll have. And the current growth rate is quite good. In fact, last quarter it was 7.8%. Of course, the 50% tariff by US is an unexpected event. So the government strategy is fourfold to tackle these tariffs. One is helping the affected exporting industries with various measures. Second is diversifying the exports to other countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America. Third is speed up the FTAs with EU and other countries. Fourth, of course, continuing the dialogue on trade agreement with the US. So this is the approach Indian government is following for the, to tackle the tariff thing. But also there are many domestic tailwinds in recent GST reforms, low inflation, rate cuts and CRR cut by RBI, and good monsoon, and measures in the last budget like capital expenditure, tax reduction, etc. So this will lead to more consumption and also more investment. In fact, the rating agency S&P raised India's rating to BBB after 18 years. So I'm optimistic we will also overcome this shock of tariffs and continue the higher growth. Turning to the future, India is aspiring to become developed country status in terms of per capita income by 2047. As mentioned earlier, Japan, Korea, China, even small countries like Singapore, they have higher growth rates of 8 to 10%. So which is possible. So we're not asking any, which is not possible. But there are estimates which show that we need, nominal growth of 11 to 12%, and real growth of 7 to 8% to achieve this goal. So it has to increase from $4 trillion dollar economy to $30 trillion economy by 2047. So almost 8 times we have to grow. And what are the sources of growth? Investment and exports are the two engines of growth. So some increase in investment rate, including domestic and foreign private investment, efficiency in capital use, and also increase in total factor productivity can boost growth. But savings is also important because rise in savings, will lead to more investment. As mentioned earlier, the private investment is also probably now they are making. And other sources of growth are, of course, as mentioned, we have young workforce, rise in human capital, digital technology, the young population with median age of around 28 years compared to the aging population of developing countries, and also urbanization, because urbanization may increase to 35-40% in the near future, and also role of women's labor force participation, it increases, GDP also increases. So we take this opportunity of tariff shocks and concentrate on domestic growth and undertake reforms. The Prime Minister from the Red Fort also mentioned about Atmanirbhar Bharat and increase in domestic economic growth. In fact, he gave a call for Swadeshi. Swadeshi doesn't mean import substitution, but increase in competitiveness and also more, critical things like semiconductors, chips, and critical minerals like rare earths. We should have some self-sufficiency in this geopolitical, period. And also, Prime Minister also mentioned deregulation and improving ease of doing business. We are busy with that, how to deregulate and ease of doing business across union government as well as the state governments. So in achieving higher growth rate for India, states play an important role because it's a cooperative federalism in making these reforms. And also it's a healthy sign. The states are competing by announcing goals of GDP and per capita GDP. Many studies have shown that we have to also improve state capacity of governance. It's important to raising incomes and delivering public services. Similarly, decentralization of resources to panchayats by panchayats and municipal councils is also important. So we may restore India's past economic glory by 2043, as the book says, when the share of India in world GDP is likely to be 25% in PPP terms. So to conclude, so I am optimistic that we'll become Viksit Bharat by 2047. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So with this, I request Prof. Srivastava to give his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking Professor Charan Singh for offering this platform, this wonderful platform, to discuss with you this theme and the book that is on this theme of India's growth journey. Let me also express my gratitude to Professor Mahendra, who had agreed to chair this session and offer his valuable comments on the book and the overall growth prospects that India has. Let me also thank Professor Das, who made very pertinent observations initially. And let me then say that this is a theme that Professor Charan Singh, Professor Mahendra, Professor Das, and many of the participants who are here have actually witnessed this growth as it went up and down over its challenges and over its potential. Over the last 75 years or so, many of us have actually just observed all of this. And for us, it is actually possible to take a little romantic view of this because now many of those challenges are in the past. And we decided to describe this entire journey in terms very summarily of just one chart, which is about India's trend growth rate. That is to say, if we abstract from the year-to-year volatility of growth and look at the underlying trend, then you would see that is shown here in the chart that it is like an uphill journey where one or two valleys we come across as we move across the mountain. And we decided that we will name some of these distinct phases in a way such that it describes the essence of that period. So the first period that we identify is what I call colonial legacy phase. The Indian economy in those early 50s was emaciated because of the colonial exploitation. We were a subsistence economy, hand to mouth. Our saving rate was as low as 10.4%. Our combined tax GDP ratio in those days was only 6.1%. With that kind of saving rate, it was very hard to produce any meaningful growth rate. And still, we clocked an average of 4% because we were still dominated by agriculture, and agriculture was by itself able to show a growth of in excess of 3%. So we clocked a growth of 4% in that first colonial legacy phase that in our view extended from 51, 52 to 62, 63. And then a major policy choice was exercised. And that choice was, in fact, in our book, we have included an appendix in which a memorandum that was given by Milton Friedman to Government of India in those days has been included. And Government of India acted just opposite of whatever was recommended by Friedman. Friedman had said in that memorandum that, look, you have very low saving and investment rate, your capital is scarce economy, therefore you should avoid two extremes. Do not go for very small or medium, very small scale industries because they will always require support as you go along, but your government resources are very meager, you cannot offer too many subsidies. And you should not go for very heavy capital intensive industries because your capital is scarce. It would be not appropriate at this stage of your growth to go for these two choices. But as luck would have it, we were persuaded more by the socialist thought in those days, and we inclined our economy, we directed our economy more and more towards what I call the socialist pattern phase, where we wanted to put the public sector on the commanding heights of the economy. And those public sector entities actually were guzzlers, users of capital, very heavy capital intensive choices that were made at that time. So with that meager saving rate, 10.4, even though in the next phase the saving rate increased, the investment rate also increased from 13.8% to 17.2%. But in spite of that increase in the investment rate, the growth rate fell. And the growth rate fell to an average or trend growth rate of 3.6%. That is the trough or the valley that we are tracing at the end of the second phase. This was the outcome of our choices for a capital scarce economy. But Professor Raj Krishna, who was a very eminent economist at that time, deprecated that growth and somehow linked it to the concept of Hindu growth rate. We were young economists in those days, as was Professor Mahendra, and I was always intrigued as to what is it that links it to the Hindu growth rate. Was there any suggestion in our scriptures? Was there any thought in our Sanatan literature on economics? What is it that linked it to the Hindu growth rate? Although it was difficult to find an answer at that time for me, but I continued to work on that, and eventually I am going to contend towards the end of this presentation as to how to really relate Sanatan concepts of growth, saving, investment, and growth. And that answer is actually much different than what was given in those days. In fact, the term became so popular that even nowadays many writers, many analysts continue to say, whoever growth rate falls, they say we are going towards the Hindu growth rate of 3% or 3.5%. But that is far from the truth. So that was the choice that we made. But then slowly we began to realize that if we have to really uplift our growth, then we have to bring in a more active role for the private sector of the economy, and that is the phase that we call as the mixed economy phase. In that phase, we began to give a greater and greater importance to private sector initiatives, although we were still dominated by the industrial policies and so on. So this period of about 35 years, from 1950s to the mid 80s, were characterized by a very limited saving rate, a limited real investment rate, but growth was still rising. But it had been restored back to 4%. That was the growth rate of the early 50s. Up to now, we had crossed 35 years, and something very important happened in the mid 80s. And to explain what happened in the mid 80s, I would like to move to the next slide, and then I will come back to this slide again. So in the next slide, we are tracing as some major structural changes that happened in the mid 80s. 2 or 3 that I am going to emphasize. The first one on the left side of the charts shows the structural change in terms of the evolving nature of the output side of the economy. So the share of agriculture, which was close to 55-56% in the early 50s, had started to fall progressively throughout these 35 years or so. And we come across a threshold at this point, around 85, 86, when in fact this share of services overtook the share of agriculture. Agriculture, even in good years, could grow at 3% or so. Services growth was 6 to 7% even in those years. And therefore, when the economy was getting more and more dominated by the services sector, overall growth started to pick up in the mid 80s. It was because of this structural change. The second change, which also happened at this time, was the share of public and private sector in gross capital formation, investment in the economy. Here we are looking at the share of the private sector and the public sector. The lower curve on the right hand corner, upper corner, is that of the public sector, and the upper curve is for the private sector. So up to that socialist pattern emphasis, you see the share of public sector investment increasing and the share of private sector falling until they become almost equal in the mid 80s. But from the mid 80s onwards, again, the share of private sector increased and the share of public sector fell, which also meant that the increase in productivity, overall productivity of capital, actually got enhanced because of this structural change. The third change that we notice in the mid 80s is with reference to what was happening in terms of not overall growth, but per capita growth, per capita GDP growth. In my view, this transition that happened in the mid 80s is the most critical transformation that would inform even the future of our economy. And if you look at the bottom table, here we are looking at two relationships. So now, instead of looking at the overall GDP growth, we are looking at the trend real GDP growth vis-a-vis population growth rate. Juxtapose those together, then we get the per capita trend, real GDP per capita real GDP growth. So from the overall growth, when we derive the per capita GDP growth, you will notice that in the first 35 years, it is stagnant. The per capita trend real GDP growth is stagnant. And it is stagnant at 1.7, 1.4, 1.6, even though the overall growth rate is increasing, but the population growth rate is higher than the per capita growth. And that is what we are showing on the bottom right corner of the chart. So what is happening there is that up to 83, 84, the population growth rate is higher. It is above the per capita GDP growth. So any effort that we are making actually is not allowing us to succeed. And this also has a bearing on the saving rate. The moment we cross this threshold, when the population growth rate falls below and the per capita real GDP growth goes above the population growth rate curve, we now see there is an acceleration of the saving rate and investment rate that happens. So in fact, many econometric studies, including one that we had conducted, look at and identify structural breaks in India's growth journey. And the first major structural growth that we identified in that econometric study was precisely these years, 83, 84, 84, 85. That is when we find the first major structural break. And here we have those explanations that actually explain why this structural break happened in the mid-80s. But after that, if you see in that chart, it is all the way population growth is falling and falling. And as overall growth rate increases, the per capita real GDP growth is also increasing. Initially, it was getting doubled at every 12 to 13 to 14 years. Now it is doubling in the range of about 9 to 10 years. So that is what is happening right now. So now let me go back to the earlier page, the first chart. We identify, because of those structural breaks that happened, that we come to a position where reforms became very important. And the first reform that happened was to open up the Indian economy. Import liberalization started. And although initially it led to some major foreign exchange crisis, but that also paved the way to undertake the major policy reforms of the 1990s. And as those reforms were undertaken, we now find that we are going through an accelerating growth phase, which is lasting all the way up to the first global economic and financial crisis, which happened in 2007-8. After that, we have included in our phase, we have gone up to 2011-12, because with policy interventions and so on, it was possible to actually minimize the impact on the Indian economy of that first global crisis. And we continue to grow at an average rate of 6.5%. In fact, at its peak, it had become 6.8%. And after that, there was a fall. In fact, another major crisis hit the Indian economy, hit the world economy actually. And then that is what explains the second dip, so that's why we call this global crisis phase, even though the overall growth rate now is still on average 6.1%. But we were one of the first to emerge out of this global crisis phase. And we emerged very strongly beyond the COVID period. And that is why I say that we have come to a stabilized Hindu growth phase. I will spend some time on this just to explain why I am saying that the Hindu growth phase could be 7%, as Professor Charan Singh was indicating. It could be even higher. And I will explain as to what is the logic behind this. But before that, let me request my colleague Tarang Kapoor to take you through some of the important policy initiatives that happened along this period. And then I'll come back to look at the growth prospects again. So Tarang, can you take it up?
Thank you, sir. A very good evening to all, and I thank Professor Charanjit Singh, Professor Mahendra Dev, Professor Das, and Dr. Srivastava for this opportunity. So in the book, the evolution of policy has been considered in terms of industrial policy, monetary and financial sector policy, fiscal policy, and external sector policy according to the different growth phases that we just saw on the first slide. Now, this evolution can also be considered as passing through different policy stages that may be referred to as one, getting rid of pre-independence rigidities, two, building a socialist pattern of economy consisting of inward-looking policies based on controls, licenses, etc. Three, building new capacities. Four, opening up of the economy towards market orientation and self-reliant globalization. Five, building public infrastructure for digitalization, social safety net, and income employment support policies. And six, towards Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, thus, policy evolved from first focusing on building a controlled, licensed, inward looking, import substituting rather than export promoting strategy driven economy to an efficient domestic demand driven economy, largely led by market forces, but sheltered from external upheavals through a strategy of self reliance. A key pillar of this Atmanirbhar strategy is digitalization, which is essential for managing India's large population and can help it sustain a real GDP growth of 6.5% or above. Now, some of the key individual policy initiatives are listed in are chronologically as well as classified according to the policy thrust are listed in the slides that are just being shown to you. So we move on to the first of these slides, Ragini. Yeah. So India's post-independence economic journey began with the dismantling of colonial era structures through measures such as the Zamindari Abolition Act and the abolition of privy purses. The subsequent decades saw a shift towards a socialist model marked by the industrial policy resolutions that placed the public sector in the commanding heights, nationalization of banks and coal mines, and the Garibi Hatao program of the 1970s. Between the late 1960s and early 1970s, policy emphasis turned towards capacity building through the Green Revolution and continued land reforms. By the mid 1980s, we can see the focus gradually shifted towards economic liberalization, which has continued till date. It began with import liberalization in 1985, culminating in the landmark 1991 reforms, which liberalized the financial, trade, and exchange rate regimes. Some of the key fiscal milestones included the reduction in personal income tax rates in 1997, the FRBM Act of 2003, the fuel price regulation in 2010 and 12 and 14, respectively. Now, the new monetary policy framework, which was launched in 2015, introduced flexible inflation targeting and was followed by the implementation of GST in 2017, along with and later GST rate rationalization in September 2025. Alongside liberalization, policy efforts strengthen digital infrastructure, social safety nets, and income support programs, notably through NREGA in 2005, direct benefit transfers, smart cities mission, and the JAM Trinity and the PM Kisan income support for farmers, amongst other policy initiatives. In the past decade, focus has also been on building an Atmanirbhar Bharat through initiatives such as Make in India, PM Gati Shakti, the National Monetization Pipeline, and the National Critical Minerals Mission, signaling a strategic push towards self-reliance and resilient growth. Now, in order to link our contemporary growth process to the idea of Hindu or Sanatan growth, I would like to give the presentation back to Dr. Srivastava. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarang. So now we come to talk about India's growth prospects in the context of global growth prospects. There has been a flurry of studies recently, starting from OECD study of 2021, then Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Fickey, McKinsey, and then one study that we ourselves undertook, and then one study by RBI, another study by Niti Aayog. A flurry of studies that take us into the future. In Shakespeare's Macbeth, there is this beautiful quotation which says, if you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then unto me. Although we can't say which grain will grow and which will not, but let me venture to say that India, we are stepping into uncharted territory. Not just India, the entire world is stepping into uncharted territories. Towards the end of this century, every country would have aged, including India. But India will have the advantage of having a old dependency ratio, which would still be lower than young dependency ratio until the mid 50s. That is to say, our demographic dividend would continue at least up to the mid 50s. And beyond that, also, if we were to follow our civilizational norms. That is why I say that India is the only country which has a civilizational history which is very different and very rich as compared to any other country in the globe. US in terms of civilizational terms is actually just a pygmy. China has some history, but it is nowhere comparable to what we have. Now in India, growth and saving and economic behavior was something that was talked about in our Vedas, starting from our Vedas to most of the ancient economic texts. And I, therefore, take this opportunity to link it back to the concept of Sanatan growth and just give you one or two insights into what is being said in terms of our civilizational norms. Now, if I start with, although this is not the earliest, but I start with this because this is well known in coming from Kautilya's Arthashastra. As you know that in India, 4 kinds of purushas, objectives of life, have been emphasized, which relate to dharma, artha, kam, and moksha. Moksha is when we move out from this finite world. Within this finite world, we actually relate ourselves to 3 purusharthas or objectives, which are dharma, artha, and kam. And Kautilya says in the very first chapter that you treat dharma, artha, and kam equally in a balanced way. Samam va trivargam. Trivarg is the dharma, artha, and kam. Treat them with equal importance, is what is being said by Kautilya, and says if you pursue any one of these in excess proportion compared to the others, you are bound to suffer. The balance of these 3 pursuits is what was recommended by Kautilya. And if we go even further backwards, then we find a clearer recommendation, which I trace that in Shiv Puran, in Vidyeshwar Samhita, where it says Atma Vittam Tridha Kuryat Dharma Vriddhash Pratma Bhogata. You divide your income in 3 equal parts. Devote 1 part to dharma, pursuit of dharma, 1 to pursuit of income, and 1 for consumption. This pursuit of income is possible if you devote your current 1/3 of your current income to generate next year's income, future income. That is why 1/3 of your income, of your output, that applies to an individual as well as to the country, should go for savings. And so Hindu growth rate does not prescribe a growth rate. It says this is the norm for saving. But even the saving rate, we can translate, given a contemporary context, that into an investment rate. And given the ICOR, we can then translate that into the growth rate. So presently, if our saving rate is 33.3% or so on average, we find that the investment rate would be about 35%. If the ICOR is about 5, that will generate a growth rate of 7%. And that would be the Hindu growth rate given the current realities of the Indian economy. It could be more or less, but this is the way one should interpret the civilizational recommendation regarding managing one's macroeconomy. In fact, some words can be said about the 1/3 allocation for private consumption and what happens to 1/3 beyond the savings. So 1/3 and 1/3 we have accounted for. The remaining 1/3, it is recommended, should be divided into 2 equal parts in normal times, and 1/6, 1/2 of that should be devoted for tax purposes. Taxation, giving tax revenue to one's king, is part of dharma. The other 1/6 is for the provision of social goods through private initiatives. This is the only recommendation I have seen where the concept of social goods being provided by private entities is being recommended. This is for organization of yagyas and pujas and mandirs and so on. The whole Sanatan ecosystem is built out of the private provision of social goods. So these are wonderful recommendations. And I would suggest that when we go into the march into the future, none of the present day paradigms are going to prevail. And because of the aging that will happen for both the Chinese economy and a little later the US economy, these will experience massive declines in their growth rates and per capita incomes. The challenge of the future is not to achieve high growth rate, which we are going to achieve in the next few years or so. The challenge is to stabilize it. And that stabilization can come only when we when we rely on civilizational norms. Those norms are unique to India and they are not available to anybody else. And that is why we say that as we move further and further ahead into the century, that's where uh, India will find itself in a unique position to guide the entire world. As we go forward, we take recognition of some growth enablers and some growth constraints. Demographic dividend, as I was saying, at least would last until the mid 50s. As Professor Charan Singh and Professor Mahendra also said, urbanization is going to be progressively benefiting India. Structural change would continue. Growing skilled labor force will be there, and there will be adoption of technologies of AI and Gen AI and so on, and there will be growing energy dependence. Those are all factors that will help us. But then there are various social fault lines that are also unique to us. There are climate related challenges and there are supply side disruptions. In fact, the global economy has moved out of what I say economics textbooks. All that we were taught in economics, we were not about supply side disruptions. We were taught about free trade. We were taught about export oriented economies and so on. All the history of economics is replete with that kind of thought, but the global economy is now out of economics textbooks. And that's why we have to find our own way. We will face, I would end with this, we will face our, as I said, low level equilibrium trap was crossed. We will face middle income trap in the next 5 to 6 years. But I think we will cross the middle income trap very smoothly because we are already very highly inclined towards investment in new technologies, AI, Gen AI, and so on. And the more we invest in innovative technologies, the easier it would be for us to cross the middle income trap. After that, that's where when we come to high income levels in the mid 50s or so, after having Viksit, our challenge is then to define the content of Vikas. What would characterize the Viksit status? And then make sure that we remain stable there and not turn downwards, as I suspect both China and US will turn downwards. So let us see how we negotiate the future. And my own suggestion is that we must draw from our civilizational values. So let me stop here so that let me give it back to Professor Mahendra to see whether there are any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastava and Dr. Tarun for excellent presentation summarizing the findings. Dr. Charan Singh, you want to say something? Yeah.
Professor Dev, can I ask a question?
Yeah, yeah.
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 Now, I had three questions for you, Professor Srivastava. One is the population growth rate figure that you showed. From 97 onwards, we are below the replacement rate of 2.1. Now, it's a very worrisome trend, according to me. We won't have replacement rate. And as you have projected, we'll be below 1 very soon. That's still worrisome. What would be your view on it? Because we would have trespassed the replacement rate. The second question is that Danny Roderick and Subramaniam did their study at Harvard and they found a structural break in 1985 onwards. That's when Rajiv Gandhi takes over, right? And Rajiv Gandhi being a non-traditional politician, being a pilot and all that, from the traditional politicians who were running the economy until then, and especially the Gandhi family, which was seeped in the socialist pattern. Therefore, the structural break they found in 1985 onwards. I myself did some study, which is there in the Stanford Working Paper series, where I said the structural break, according to me, comes when Narasimha Rao takes over as the Prime Minister, provides an umbrella to Manmohan Singh to carry on his structural reforms. Then you know that Rangarajan, Y.V. Reddy, Manmohan Singh, all of them put their head together, and from 93 onwards, I thought actually the structural changes took place. I'd like to have your thought on it because you said the structural change happens between 82, 83. The Hindu rate of growth. We all grew up in the same age vintage, and I justified the Hindu rate of growth from a little different angle. And to my mind, it was because India was carrying a baggage after the aftermath of the British looting us and starting to come and rule over us when we were about 18% to 20% of GDP and leaving us having sucked our bone marrow at 1% of GDP. So we were fledgling and not even able to stand. And the Indian philosophy is take everybody along. So our steady growth path was trying to build a sort of a base and strengthen ourselves. And therefore, we started with our best intentions and we were making 3%. And as we progressed, so did we scale up. And as you can see, your own study shows we are now around 6.8%. And that's according to me, that is the inclusiveness, taking everybody along, not leaving anybody behind, and moving steadily on that path. So that was my justification of 3%, 4% growth rate, but I'm more than happy to hear what you would like to say on this. Thank you very much for giving me the
Thank
time,
you.
Professor Mahendra.
Thank you. Very pertinent questions, very important questions, I think. Now, on the population growth rate, that is the projection that is being given by the global agencies. It is the fall in the population growth rate is the outcome of the increase in the per capita income, and as there is an inverse relationship that exists between these two. That is why it is expected that the population growth rate will average just about 0.6 or so until the mid 50s, and after that it may fall further. So that is not very desirable because, as you say, it is much below the replacement rate. Again, I would quote that in Indian philosophy, the size of the ideal household or family is said to be 4, husband, wife, and 2 children. And that is what is the recommended size. If that is something that we begin to emphasize again, I think we would start to increase the population growth rate slowly back towards 1% and then above it. But then, if the more we do it, the more we will be able to delay the aging process and therefore retain the saving rate at a higher level. And therefore, we should draw some civilizational lessons from out of that. The second question is as to when the structural breaks happened. Our own estimate said early 80s, about 83, 84. In some studies, it is 83, 84. In some studies, it is 84, 85. In our view, it did not happen because of any policy changes. It happened because of the three structural changes that we highlighted that happened in the mid 80s. The private sector investment having a higher share in the overall investment rate, and then the population growth rate falling below income growth rate, and then the agricultural sector share falling below service sector. So those were the structural changes that actually drove the first one. We also identify another structural break in the mid 90s, early 90s, in fact, and that I think is more due to policy initiatives. We have more structural breaks later on, but that is happening in the again because of policy changes. So structural breaks, I think I agree that there are some 1 or 2 years differences in different studies, and maybe some differences in the way it explains it. Now, on the question of Hindu growth rate, I think we have to relate. It is not low or high. It is the question. It is the relationship between a low growth rate and something that might have been drawn from Hindu scriptures or Sanatani scriptures. It is that relationship that is the one that I am questioning. And when we apply what is prescribed, then we get very different answers. And that is the reason why I say that we should draw civilizational values and norms for our future. Of course, there is a controversy in the past, but it is going to be far more important for future.
Yeah, on the 1985 to 90, we had a higher growth 4.5% and all, but that's not sustainable because that was high fiscal deficit, and even the current account deficit was high. That's why we had balance of payments crisis. So, and also the foreign exchange was very low. So that was you can increase like 2008-9 during Pranab Mukherjee time. We increased the growth rate, which was unsustainable, fiscal deficit, high inflation, and all. So even if there is some kind of break or something, but that is not unsustainable. So sustainability, started only in early 90s
Right.
with our policies.
Right. I think that's quite correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and Hindu rate of growth, still we could have managed much better. In fact, compared to Mahalanobis model, there was a paper by Vakil and Brahmananda on waste goods model. Suppose, as Dr. Srivastava mentioned, instead of going for very high capital intensive kind of thing, suppose we moderated and all, maybe labor intensive manufacturing and those things, maybe we could have got higher growth and higher employment. And also we didn't give importance to, basic education and other things like East Asia and all. So probably our history would have been much better or kind of thing. Of course, there were many good things happened during that time. When I said the irrigation projects and IITs, IIMs, and many things happened, Green Revolution. But labor-intensive manufacturing and education, health, those things would have been much better.
Right. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? In the chat box, some are there. Yeah, again, structural break, we already talked. Yes. Any others?
There's a very interesting question on Punjab. Professor Srivastava. Punjab is a classic case. Number 1 state GSDP in 2000, number 14 already in 2025. So I do not know. There's a question in the chat box. I'm reading from there. Some Vedant has asked that question. We at EGROW have done almost every state has come and made a presentation on their state performance. Some are remaining and they'll be doing it in the next 3 months. Now, would you have any comment on that? And I would like Professor Mahendra Dev, when we talk of Viksit Bharat, I was very happy when at Niti Aayog, the Prime Minister told the states to come and join as a team. Now, at the center for the last 4 years, I'm hearing Viksit Bharat, but at the state level, I don't see that spirit and that passion and that urge to be Viksit Bharat. So maybe this question is being asked in that spirit. And Professor Mahendra Dev and you probably would like to share your thoughts on it. The other question which has been asked in the chat box, which you may like to consider, I'm just articulating those questions in the chat box and finding a rationale why they're being asked, is this question on, and I think this is a scholarly question, how do you determine a structural change? In our econometric classes, we have always mentioned about it, but maybe you want to mention it here. And the other thing which I thought was a good question, which you may like to, this is the question on demographic dividend, right? And you mentioned mid-50s, and I think somebody by the name Professor Agarwal or who has asked this question. Yeah, it's Kankala Satyanarayana who has asked this question. Can India enjoy the demographic dividend even further decades? Maybe you want to answer these questions. I've just picked them up from the chat box.
Right. So on the question about states participating in the journey towards Vikas, I think the position of Punjab is very important because Punjab was one of the richest states when we began this journey. And then over time, its relative position actually fell down the ladder. In my view, because of two main reasons, there may be other reasons also. One is that Punjab became indebted very early on. And government indebtedness increased so much so that government policies actually could not intervene much towards supporting farmers, providing necessary support towards fertilizers, seeds, and so on. So agriculture as a whole, when a state economy is agriculture centric, it is bound to get an overall growth rate which is lower than the growth rate of other states that are more service centric or industry centric. Because of the nature of growth rates in these three sectors, agricultural growth over a long period of time had averaged just 2.5 to 3%. So even if you do very well in agriculture, your overall growth in good years would be 3.5% or so. Whereas as industry and services would give you a growth of 7 to 8%. So overall balance would keep getting tilted against that state. And therefore what is required is an intervention that would take Punjab back towards an emphasis on industries and services while maintaining its emphasis on agriculture. That requires different kinds of policy configuration. The other thing is that the central government has, that is a broader question that you actually expanded that question as to what is happening at the level of the states. At the level of the states, what we find is that convergence has not taken place over time in terms of GDP. Convergence has taken taken place more in terms of consumption expenditures, but not in terms of per capita GDP. And the reason for that is mostly overall growth is dependent on the distribution of capital assets or investment in the capital stock in the economy. We have analyzed the interstate distribution of capital stock in the economy, private capital stock in the economy. And we find that that is very heavily concentrated in the belt that is going from Gujarat, from western Gujarat, Maharashtra states towards the east, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and all Karnataka, all in between. It's very heavily concentrated in that area. A good part of north and good part of east is actually left out. And that is the reason why we are finding this growing divergence. So we find a Professor Mahendra in an expert in that. There is a club convergence that we find, but overall there is a divergence that is happening. So groups of states are converging, but between groups there is divergence that is happening.
Dr. Prem Vasist, you wanted to speak.
So
You are on mute. You are on mute. Yeah.
Srivastava, congratulations for a very elusive and deep analysis. On the Sanatan part, when you say and you are relating to 7% rate of growth, what you would like to call as Hindu rate of growth, you did talk about the family size. You did talk about the allocation of income in three parts. But are there any implicit assumptions about the nature of technology that you envisage, say, in future? And can you link it with some kind of Sanatan concept?
well, technology in general, the direction in which technology is moving, in my view, is anti-human. It will actually lead to considerable catastrophe as we go along. The more and more we depend on technology, the more and more the human side will become machine-like. Gandhiji used to say in his Hind Swaraj that he was so much opposed to machines, and we are now at a different end. Of course, that is taking to a philosophical debate. He said that from the pit of machines are like a pit of snakes, and only more and more snakes will get generated out of it. The technology will eventually lead to a catastrophe for the human race. The more we develop internal equilibrating mechanisms to neutralize or normalize the external expansion. All technologies are expansions of human limbs and senses. They actually expand our sense domains. And therefore, technology, there is an external expansion of human limbs and senses. And that should be neutralized or normalized by internal meditation and so on. So Sanatan has an answer to this. But that would take us into another major debate as to the nature and impact of technology. But my view is that initially we have to really go along and adopt and then develop strategies to counter the adverse or negative impact of technology on human psyche.
So we have 5 more minutes probably. Any 1 or 2 questions, then we can close. Yeah, Mr. Chatterjee. Yeah, you are on mute.
Sir, main thing I was asking that the during the socialist era, the rate of growth was low, but the system implemented during that time wasn't that necessary according to the situation and context back then, sir. That's my question.
Well, in my view, as long as we had that very low saving rate, we should have delayed that initiative towards socialist pattern. Initially, I think Professor Mahendra observed that we got delayed by 15 years compared to China and other countries. In fact, had we delayed that socialist emphasis another decade and a half, we would have been much better off with those initiatives. And we could have actually reached the levels that we have reached now a little earlier. Probably we would have been ahead in terms of the competitive race with China and so on.
Yeah. Just on
I'm saying that
regional,
it was not unimportant. Those initiatives were not unimportant.
yeah.
Those initiatives were useful, but they should have come a little later.
Yeah. See, compared to pre-independence period, which was stagnant and all, I mean, 3.5 was not a bad thing, but we could have done much better.
Yes, yes, yes.
And on regional inequalities, my studies showed that in per capita income, there is a divergence across states. I mean, I've looked at from almost 20 years up to 2019. The per capita income, the richer states are growing faster compared to the, less developed states. And but there is a convergence in human development, in health, education, and those things, because the Bihar is also catching up with Kerala, and so over time they will catch up. But there is a limit, 100% literacy, or those infant mortality, those limits. So the less developed states are catching up in human development, but per capita income, it is diverging. But states also announced the Viksit Bharat goals. For example, Telangana state announced 3 trillion economy by 2047. Like that, UP and others are also announcing. But how to implement and all, still work in progress. But to end, even the Viksit Bharat doesn't mean only growth. We also have to have inclusiveness and sustainability, which the Prime Minister also mentions. Inclusiveness, particularly employment, is very important, because that is one thing which can, have inclusive also social sector like health, education, those things. And of course, we can't ignore climate change, sustainability, those issues are also becoming important. So with these 3 goals are important for Viksit Bharat, apart from growth. So with this, I thank Dr. Srivastava and all the authors for this excellent book. And I'm sure that many people will read it and benefit from this. And also thank Dr. Charan Singh and Mr. Vishal Das for giving this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank
Professor
you.
Mahendra,
Yeah.
if you permit,
To all.
only if you permit, we had time till 5, it's 5:18, so I know you've done it correctly. But Jaskaran and Saru Dasgupta have raised their hand. Would you
Okay.
permit me to ask them?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So Jaskaran and Saru, be brief.
Yeah.
We are extending our time. Just we saw your raised hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for this special opportunity. Sir, my question is to Srivastava, sir. Sir, you have advocated a civilizational advantage to the Indian economy. You have given some specific example from the Vedas and Kautilya's Arthashastra. Like how you would rate the present like growth narrative in India. Like you are, if I found correctly to you, you are also advocating urbanization in your presentation. Like what we are doing now, what our philosophy is teaching us. Like you have given us the example of Pursartha, and how we should, are we linking this philosophy, or just like in previous presentation we have talked about digitalization, and I think you have also negated technology, use of technology, how we are doing and what we are learning from our past. Like now we are talking about Indian knowledge system, advocating Indian knowledge system. Are the Indian knowledge system really guiding us, or just we are only doing like in our including our syllabuses? Thank you.
Yes, I think very important question. Yes.
Professor, let me take from Saru also. Saru, please be brief. Saru Dasgupta, please be brief. And then we'll go back to Saru Dasgupta. You raised your hand. Okay, I think Dr. Srivastava,
Yeah,
you
okay.
could go
So
ahead.
I'll take this question.
Yeah.
I think very important question actually, because it appears at first sight that the times have changed so much from those ancient times when those Sanatan texts were written, that how is it that one can consider applying those norms to modern times? That seems to be a very obvious and clear question. In my view, the norms that were provided in our Sanatan texts are timeless, are independent of the turmoil of time. And therefore, we have to really look at their interpretation in the way that would be relevant for modern times. So one is not advocating actually either giving up technology, use of digitalization, or progress towards urbanization. None of those. Those are all unavoidable and are going to happen. But how to balance that, their impact on the human psyche? So there is an expansion outside, then there has to be a balance by an expansion inside. That is what our texts actually advocate. And therefore, all this digitalization, dependence on computers, all of that is going to be disastrous if we do not match that with an equal emphasis on our practices of meditation and generating internal equilibrium and so on. If we do not do that, then there would be tremendous social upheaval and unrest. And therefore, we have to really step into future with great care. And I think that Sanatan norms and values will guide us towards a proper future.
Yeah, over to Dr. Charan Singh.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahendra Dev. As I was mentioning, we changed the date and you were kind enough to stand by us and still spend time with us today. Thank you so much. And Dr. Srivastava, always a pleasure listening to you, looking at your analysis. Again, a very rich analysis that you presented and tried to capture it in the book, the past, present, and future. I think it's the first book that I've seen with 100-year canvas in front of us. I also totally agree with you that the Vedas, the principles that are guiding us are important, and the principles are very clear. 1/3 is going into investment. Obviously, is going to be highly growth oriented. So I think those sort of principles where we really balance our pursuit of spirituality and our economic growth, and the pursuit of spirituality would guide us towards contentment, and towards growth would guide us to innovation, creativity, and the understanding that the new gives the old gives way to the new, and that's how the generations move on. And yesterday, when we were discussing about the Nobel Prize, it was so obvious that the Shiva's creative destruction is so very important. So that way, the principles that are given in our civilizational memory and our civilizational text are a guiding force for us. And therefore, I think the point you have made is very good. The Prime Minister spoke about the care, the circular economy, and also spoke about life. And I think those are all coming from the civilizational values that we in India nurture. And therefore, I think that is the guiding force, that despite what we were, the golden sparrow for 3,000 years, unlike the industrialized countries for 300 years, and they brought us to the climatic catastrophe, and our 3,000 years of prosperity, everything was so smooth and there was hardly any conflict with nature, whereas the modern concept of growth has brought us totally in conflict with nature. So I totally concede that point of yours, that we need to be in sync with the nature, and that's coming basically from our civilizational values. Thank you for that. I would also like to thank the participants for having asked these questions. Your own colleague and young author who presented to us the data, and to thank Dr. Kapoor for that. I have to make two announcements. One is we all want to grow, we all want to win. And in our country, we have an author, Mr. Shiv Khera, who writes very positive books. So we have invited him to come and speak to us next Friday from 4:30 to 5:30, asking him to tell us how can we win and become a Viksit Bharat. As has already been explained by Professor Mahendra Dev, Viksit Bharat is not per capita income, but the Prime Minister in the economic survey, the Finance Minister has delineated clearly the 6 steps that we think are significant symptoms of Viksit Bharat. Female labor force participation to increase, farmers to benefit and become the global basket for food, 100% skilled labor, high quality school education, high quality health, and zero poverty. So we are believing in inclusive growth and just not hinging ourselves on per capita income of this or that value. So India's vision of Viksit Bharat is a very rich and modern concept. We spoke to Shiv Khera and we requested him in this sort of situation, what would he guide us as economists to take it forward? So next week, 4:30 to 5:30, Shiv Khera will be with us and talking to us how can we win as a country. While he keeps writing books how we can win as an individual, I've requested him if he can help us visualize how can we win as a country in the galaxy of 200 odd countries. So would invite you for that. The foundation, the think tank is also working on lots of dissemination, and November 1 to 3, we are going to offer a course on RBI database. So if any one of you, and it's a very nominally priced, about 5 hours of exercises workshop online, and we are charging a very nominal amount. And the reason we are charging is because in our experience, whenever we have offered something free, we find a casual approach. So we are just charging 199 for 5 hours. So please feel free to take advantage of that database education which we are providing. Have a look at it. It's on our website and take the advantage of that. With that, once again, thanks to each one of you. Special thanks to Professor Mahendra Dev and Dr. Srivastava for spending this weekend, just weekend before Diwali, spending this weekend with us and talking about this important issue. I'm sure the presentation has cheered you up. We are a great country. We carry a great baggage from our civilization richness, and we are going to very soon reach there again. Great moral booster for all of us. With that, have a great weekend. Have a great Diwali. I hope you will burn some green crackers, taking care of our celebratory mood. And I hope to look forward to seeing you again next Friday. Thank you.
Happy Diwali to all of us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Happy Diwali to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you, Professor Mahendra.